Every Thanksgiving for 15 years, an elderly woman cooked a full feast and set the table for 12 people. But nobody ever came. Neighbors whispered she was crazy, cooking for ghosts and memories. Then, one Thanksgiving, a billionaire knocked on her door and discovered the heartbreaking truth that changed everything. Margaret Holloway stood in her small kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, her 78-year-old hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared a feast that had become her annual ritual for the past 15 years. The aroma of roasting turkey filled her modest two-bedroom house, accompanied by the scent of homemade stuffing, fresh-baked rolls, sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, cranberry sauce simmering on the stove, and 3 pies cooling on the counter: pumpkin, apple, and pecan. The same menu she'd prepared every Thanksgiving since 1963, when she'd married her beloved Robert. Her kitchen was spotless despite the cooking chaos, everything organized with the precision of a woman who'd been feeding family for over 50 years, who'd built her identity around the act of nourishing people she loved. But Margaret's dining room table, set with her good china and crystal glasses, her cloth napkins folded perfectly beside each plate, had 12 place settings arranged as carefully as if guests were expected at any moment. The problem was that no guests were coming, hadn't come for 15 years, not since the accident that had taken her entire family in one devastating moment. Her husband Robert, her daughter Linda, and son-in-law Michael, her 4 grandchildren ranging in age from 6 to 15, all gone in a multi-car pileup on the interstate while driving to Margaret's house for Thanksgiving dinner in 2008. Margaret had been waiting at home, checking the turkey temperature and worrying they were running late, when the police arrived with news that shattered her world completely. The neighbors on Maple Street had grown accustomed to Margaret's strange annual ritual, watching her carry grocery bags into her house every November, seeing the lights on in her dining room, sometimes catching glimpses through the window of an elderly woman sitting alone at a table set for 12, talking to empty chairs as if they were occupied. Some neighbors felt sorry for her, understanding that grief had broken something in her mind, that she was living in a reality where her family still existed. Others found it unsettling, crossing the street to avoid her house, telling their children to stay away from the crazy old woman who cooked for ghosts. A few had tried to intervene over the years, suggesting gently that she join community Thanksgiving dinners, that she see a therapist, that she stop torturing herself with this painful ritual. But Margaret politely declined all offers, insisting she was fine, that she had plans, that her family would be joining her. What none of the neighbors understood, what Margaret had never explained to anyone, was that cooking the Thanksgiving dinner wasn't about denial or delusion. She knew her family was gone, lived with that knowledge every single day, felt the emptiness of her house in every quiet moment. But Thanksgiving had been her day, the holiday when her identity as wife, mother, grandmother had felt most complete and meaningful. Preparing the feast, even knowing no one would eat it, was her way of honoring their memory, of keeping alive the part of herself that had been defined by caring for people she loved. It was meditation and memorial combined, her hands performing the rituals that connected her to decades of happy memories, her kitchen becoming a space where her family still existed in the recipes they'd loved, the traditions they'd shared, the love that death couldn't erase, even though it had taken everyone who'd received that love. After finishing the cooking, Margaret would set the table with heartbreaking care, placing name cards at each seat, Robert at the head, Linda and Michael on one side, the 4 grandchildren arranged by age, and her own place nearest the kitchen so she could serve everyone efficiently. She'd light candles, pour wine in the adult glasses, and juice in the children's cups, then sit in her chair and close her eyes, remembering 15 Thanksgivings that had been full of noise and laughter and chaos and love. She'd say grace aloud as if they were all listening, thank God for the blessings they'd shared, ask for peace for their souls and strength to continue living without them. Then she'd sit in the silence, sometimes for hours, before finally clearing the table, packing the untouched food into containers, and driving to the homeless shelter downtown where she'd donate everything she'd cooked, telling the staff it was extra from her family gathering, unable to admit even to strangers that she'd cooked a feast for people who would never come. This particular Thanksgiving, Margaret was stirring gravy on the stove when her doorbell rang unexpectedly at 2:30 in the afternoon, the sound startling her because nobody visited anymore, her few remaining friends having drifted away over years of declined invitations and uncomfortable encounters with her grief. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find a man in his early 50s standing on her porch, expensive suit slightly disheveled, his face showing exhaustion and something like desperation. Behind him in the driveway sat a black luxury sedan with a driver waiting inside. The man looked at Margaret with apology in his eyes. "I'm so sorry to bother you on Thanksgiving. My name is James Patterson. My car broke down about 2 blocks from here, and my phone died. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." Margaret studied James for a moment, noting the quality of his clothing, the Rolex on his wrist, the obvious wealth that marked him as someone from a very different world than her modest neighborhood. But she also saw genuine distress in his expression, recognized the look of someone having a difficult day, and her instinct to help people in need overrode any caution about inviting strangers into her home. "Of course, dear. Come in. The phone is in the kitchen." James followed her inside, immediately hit by the overwhelming aroma of Thanksgiving dinner, his stomach growling audibly because he'd been driving for 6 hours trying to reach his daughter's house for the holiday, his own family dinner in jeopardy because of the car trouble. He noticed the elaborate table setting visible through the dining room doorway, confused about why this elderly woman living alone had prepared such an extensive feast. Margaret handed James her phone and watched him make calls, first to a towing company that informed him nothing was available until Friday, then to his driver who confirmed the car's engine was completely dead, finally to his daughter, who'd been expecting him hours ago. James's frustration grew with each call, the realization sinking in that he was stranded in a strange neighborhood on Thanksgiving Day, unable to reach his family, his carefully planned holiday completely derailed. When he finished, he handed the phone back to Margaret with genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much. I've called for a rental car, but it won't be available until 6 this evening. I'll wait outside so I don't impose on your Thanksgiving dinner. You must have family arriving soon." Margaret looked at this wealthy stranger standing in her kitchen, saw the loneliness and disappointment in his face that mirrored her own perpetual state, and made a decision that surprised even herself. "I don't have family arriving. I did have family, but they're gone now. I cooked this dinner because it's what I've always done, but I'll be eating alone like every year. You're welcome to join me. I have more than enough food, and nobody should be alone on Thanksgiving if they don't have to be." James stared at her, confused by the situation, uncertain why this woman had cooked an enormous meal if she was eating alone, but moved by the genuine invitation in her voice. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on whatever you have planned." Margaret smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years, because someone would actually be sitting at her table, eating the food she'd prepared with love, making the ritual feel less like madness and more like its original purpose. "I'm absolutely sure. Let me set an extra place." She moved toward the dining room, and James followed, stopping in the doorway when he saw the table set for 12. The name cards, the candles, the elaborate arrangement that spoke of expectations for a large gathering. Margaret saw his confusion and decided to explain what she'd never told her neighbors. 15 years ago, my entire family was killed in a car accident on their way to Thanksgiving dinner at my house. My husband, my daughter, and son-in-law, my 4 grandchildren. Everyone I loved most in the world, gone in an instant. James felt his heart break for this stranger, understanding immediately hitting him about the table setting, the empty chairs, the ritual she'd maintained through years of grief. "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine that loss. But why cook this elaborate dinner every year? Doesn't it make the pain worse?" Margaret's response was quiet, but firm. "It's the only way I know to honor them, to keep them alive in some way. Cooking was how I showed love when they were alive. Continuing to cook, even knowing they'll never eat it, is how I show love now that they're gone. People think I'm crazy, cooking for ghosts, but it's not about denial. It's about remembering that I was someone's wife, someone's mother and grandmother, that those roles mattered and shaped who I am. If I stop cooking this dinner, I'm afraid I'll forget what it felt like to be the person they loved." James understood loss in ways that Margaret's comfortable suburban neighbors never had. His own wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier. His children grown and building their own lives. His wealth unable to fill the emptiness left by her absence. He'd thrown himself into work, built his technology company into a billion-dollar empire. But success felt hollow without someone to share it with. Without the woman who'd believed in him when he was nobody. Seeing Margaret's ritual, understanding her need to maintain connection with people who'd defined her identity, resonated with his own struggle to find meaning after devastating loss. "May I join you for dinner? Not as charity or pity, but because I understand what you're doing. And I think maybe we both need this today." They sat together at the table set for 12, Margaret in her usual seat, and James in the chair marked with her husband's name card. Margaret served the meal she'd prepared, explaining the significance of each dish. The stuffing recipe from Robert's mother, the sweet potato casserole her daughter Linda had perfected, the green beans her oldest granddaughter had helped prepare, starting at age 5. James listened to stories about people he'd never met, learning about Robert's career as a high school history teacher, Linda's work as a pediatric nurse, the grandchildren's personalities and dreams that had been cut short by the accident. Margaret talked more than she had in 15 years, the words pouring out because someone was finally listening, because James asked questions and showed genuine interest in keeping her family's memory alive through storytelling. James shared his own loss, talking about his wife Rebecca, who'd fought cancer for 2 years while encouraging him to keep building his business, who'd made him promise not to stop living after she died, who'd worried he'd become isolated in his wealth, and forget how to connect with real people beyond business transactions. He admitted he'd been failing at that promise, that work had consumed him, that his relationships with his adult children had become superficial and distant, that he'd been driving to his daughter's house out of obligation rather than genuine desire for connection. Margaret listened with the compassion that comes from understanding grief, offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving unimaginable loss. They ate the Thanksgiving dinner slowly, savoring food that had been prepared with love, sharing stories and comfortable silences, two lonely people finding unexpected connection in circumstances that seemed almost divinely arranged. When they finished eating, James helped Margaret clear the table and wash dishes, an intimacy that felt natural despite being strangers hours earlier. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, James mentioned casually that he ran a foundation, supporting grief counseling and family services, that his wife's death had inspired him to fund programs helping people process loss and rebuild their lives. Margaret shared that she'd never sought counseling, that she'd managed her grief through this annual ritual and occasional volunteering at the homeless shelter where she donated her Thanksgiving food each year. James paused in his dish drying, an idea forming. What if you didn't have to eat alone next year? What if your Thanksgiving dinner actually fed people who needed it? My foundation works with organizations serving vulnerable populations. We could arrange for you to cook in a community kitchen, preparing this same meal for homeless families, foster children, elderly people without family. You'd be honoring your family's memory by feeding people who are alone on Thanksgiving. And you wouldn't have to sit at an empty table anymore. Margaret felt tears welling up, the idea resonating with something deep in her soul, offering a way to transform her private grief ritual into something that served others while still honoring her family. The following year, Margaret cooked Thanksgiving dinner in a community center kitchen, preparing her traditional menu for 80 people who otherwise would have spent the holiday alone or hungry. James's foundation funded the entire program, and James himself showed up to help serve, bringing his daughter and son-in-law, his grandchildren meeting Margaret and hearing stories about the family she'd lost. The program became annual, growing each year, Margaret training other grieving people in the therapeutic power of cooking for others, transforming loss into service, private sorrow into community care. She still set a table with 12 place settings, but now it was surrounded by dozens of other tables filled with people eating food prepared with love. The dining room of the community center alive with noise and laughter and connection. James and Margaret became close friends, both understanding that their Thanksgiving meeting hadn't been random breakdown luck, but something more meaningful. Two people who'd needed each other finding connection when they'd both been lost in grief and isolation. James credited Margaret with reminding him why wealth mattered. Not for accumulation, but for the ability to fund programs that helped people heal and connect, to transform resources into meaningful impact on real lives. Margaret credited James with giving her permission to stop living in the past, to honor her family's memory not by sitting alone at a table for ghosts, but by feeding people who reminded her that love doesn't die when people do, that the capacity to nurture and care for others continues even after loss takes away the specific people we loved most. The neighbors on Maple Street, who'd watched Margaret's strange ritual for years with pity and discomfort, saw her house dark on subsequent Thanksgivings, assumed she'd finally stopped the crazy tradition or perhaps had died herself. They didn't. No, she was 3 miles away in a community center, serving turkey and stuffing to people society had forgotten, her kitchen skills and capacity for love finding new purpose, her grief transformed from isolated ritual into community service that honored her family's memory by embodying the values they'd shared. They didn't know that the billionaire whose car had broken down on their street that random Thanksgiving had recognized in Margaret's lonely ritual the same hunger for meaningful connection he'd been feeling. That their unlikely friendship had sparked a program now operating in 15 cities, feeding thousands of people annually while giving grieving individuals a way to transform loss into legacy. And they didn't know that Margaret Holloway, the crazy old woman who'd cooked for ghosts, had taught a billionaire that the greatest wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in moments of genuine human connection. That healing comes not from forgetting loss, but from channeling grief into service. That sometimes the worst day of your life, a car breakdown, a devastating accident, can become the catalyst for transformation that reminds us we're never truly alone, as long as we're brave enough to open our doors to strangers who might become family, to share our stories with people who'll listen, and to transform private sorrow into love that feeds the world's hungry, heals the world's broken, and proves that the people we've lost continue to matter through the ways their love continues to shape us and inspire the good we do in their memory.